Good day, everyone. Today we are going to talk about one of the most controversial and avoided topic. But first, disclaimer that I am not an expert on this field of study, and also everything on my presentation is just a fruit of my research from the internet. But before we move on our topic, I would like to ask you a question. Would you kill a person for mercy? Some people might say yes, and some people might disagree with a big no. And I believe that a person who would say yes on this question will take a lot of courage and empathy to do so, while people who would say no has a big respect for the sanctity of life. So for our today's topic, we're going to talk about the act of killing a person for mercy, or what we call euthanasia. Euthanasia is an act of intentionally ending a life to relieve suffering. Also, euthanasia is another name for mercy killing. The term is often used to refer to assisted suicide that is deemed beneficial to one suffering. Also, euthanasia was defined by Merriam-Webster as a practice of act of killing someone who is very sick or injured in order to prevent any more suffering. And euthanasia has three types. The first type of euthanasia is what we call the voluntary euthanasia. The second is the non-voluntary euthanasia. And lastly, the involuntary euthanasia. The very first type of euthanasia is what we call the voluntary euthanasia. It is when euthanasia is conducted with the consent of the patient. And one of the greatest examples of this is what we call the assisted suicide. Assisted suicide happens when a patient asks for a prescription of a physician to undergo euthanasia. And currently, voluntary euthanasia is legal in Belgium, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Switzerland, and the states of Oregon and Washington in the US. The next type of euthanasia is what we call the non-voluntary euthanasia. It happens when euthanasia is conducted on a person who is unable to consent due to their health condition. And the best example of this are patients who are under a vegetative state. It could be they are having their life support or brain dead and under coma. In this scenario, the decision will be made an, uh, by another appropriate person. It could be their parents, wives, or legal guardian. And they are the one who will decide whether the patient should live or not. The last type is what we call the involuntary euthanasia. It happens when euthanasia is performed on a person who would be able to provide consent but does not, either because they do not want to die or because they were not asked. And one of the greatest examples of this is what happened on Germany on the war of Nazis to Jews, when Adolf Hitler ordered the soldiers to kill Jews who were injured, disabled, and elderly to just end their suffering. This is often called murder in disguise of euthanasia. Euthanasia was also classified based on its procedure. First is what we call the passive euthanasia. It is when a life-sustaining treatment is being removed to the patient. This commonly happens with the involuntary euthanasia, where a vegetative state patient is being removed by the life-sustaining machine that they are using for them to be in peace. And for the second type is what we call the active euthanasia. It is when someone uses a lethal substance or force to end a patient's life, whether by the patient or somebody else. And in this active euthanasia, this is the procedure that is being done for assisted suicide and also sometimes in the involuntary euthanasia. But before we move on the arguments on about euthanasia, I would like to have some history first. In 5th century BC to the 1st century BC, Euthanasia was tolerated because Greeks and Romans have no cogently defined belief in inherent value of individual human lives. In the 13th century, when Thomas Aquinas espoused the Catholic teaching about suicide in arguments that would shape Christianity taught about suicide for centuries. If we recall, Saint Thomas Aquinas is one of the most prominent founder of the natural law theory, where he actually said that God preloaded us with these gifts, and in each gift there is actually a prohibition. Where they were in this teaching that they see euthanasia as a prohibition to human life. And also, since it is a religious argument and because God created you, that means you are special and you have to value your life. In the 1855, the American Medical Association officially opposed the voluntary euthanasia, though some doctors believed that the redemptive nature of suffering, the opposition was not overwhelming enough to stop the movement. The ability to relieve pain experienced as the result of surgical procedure, childbirth, or mere living logically led to conversation about death and dying. And in 19th century, the invention of widespread morphine uh, is used to be less painful dying process possible. Giza Lopez writes in Book of Dying with Dignity, a little approach to assisted death. In the mid 19th century, surgeons began in chloroform, which had few negative side effects than morphine and knocked people unconscious. And in 1957, the Vatican proclaimed that the passive euthanasia was acceptable, according to Thomas R. Cole Review, A Merciful End. Passive euthanasia is deliberately decision to withhold life-saving measures like a ventilator, knowing that death will result, hoping to take advantage of this change in public opinion after Pope's declaration. Assisted suicide advocates forbidden to focus on legalizing passive euthanasia. The very first country to legalize euthanasia is in the Netherlands in 2001 and Belgium in 2002. And in 1997, Oregon became the first state in the United States to decriminalize physician-assisted suicide. And in 2009, the Supreme Court of South Korea recognized right to die with dignity, which is a support for a voluntary euthanasia. Today, anyone choosing to die under the law in states where physician aid is legal, like Oregon, Washington, Vermont, Montana, California, must be able to self-administer the life-ending medication. And now we are going to move on with the arguments that are being done by the proponent of euthanasia and also those who are against the euthanasia. So the most common argument that you will hear from a person who is anti-euthanasia is about the sanctity of life, that our life is valuable and precious, and euthanasia would make the sanctity of life devalued. And they actually argues that our suffering is not a justification for us to end our life. And also you will hear about the moral and religious arguments. And the most common arguments that you will hear is that from Christianity and Jews that we are made from the image of God. That is why we are special, and killing ourselves will be seen immoral because we are made from the image of God itself. But but the prominent of euthanasia actually rebutted this with the claim of the euthanasia will give life more quality and dignity. So how does euthanasia give quality to the life? Instead of devaluing life, it actually gives more quality to it because when a person is had an accident which makes him or her in a vegetative state, and he can't live the way he wanted to, and he actually wanted to end his life and undergo euthanasia, he would have less suffering, which will only be which his or her memories will be only a quality memories of happiness. And also they claim that a person must have the right to choose if they want to die with dignity. And this is where their second claim comes from. For freedom of choice and dignity, advocates of euthanasia actually claims that legalizing euthanasia would open up more choices for the patients to choose from, whether he or she may want to continue the treatment while suffering, and also whether he or she may want to take the voluntary euthanasia. And this actually opens up for another claim, which is dignity, where a person must have a choice to die with dignity. And but this was actually rebutted by the anti-euthanasia by questioning the patient's competence, because freedom of choice is can be only made by those people who can make their choices. But how about those patients who are in their vegetative state who can't make any choice? Who should choose for them? And actually, the second one is guilt. They actually claim that voluntary euthanasia can be disguised as an involuntary euthanasia because of this, because guilt, because the patient will feel the guilt of his family is suffering because of his or her, because all of the resources, attention, time that they are investing for him or her. And lastly, they question about the mental illness or the mental state of a patient, because from the the goal of euthanasia is to end one's suffering. They argues that a person who is suffering can't make a right decision because the fact that he is suffering. That's why they claim that um, freedom of choice must not be used as a claim for euthanasia. Anti-euthanasia claims about the slippery slope of the euthanasia. They claim that when a person who has the same disease and actually undergoes euthanasia, this person would act as a demotivator for those who have the same diseases as his or her, because they will see that there is no hope anymore, which actually will promote suicide and devalue the sanctity of life. And the next claim that they say is about the possible recovery, because euthanasia closes the door for this recovery to happen, because since euthanasia is a one-time pain, there is no more going back. And the third claim that they say is about the regulation about legalizing euthanasia, because euthanasia can be actually used as a political agenda for someone, but also how can we regulate having this voluntary involuntary euthanasia? They question a lot more about the regulation. And the last is palliative care. We already have palliative care who caters the needs of those people who suffers from elderly and incurable diseases. So what euthanasia is for if we already have palliative care? And the advocates of euthanasia actually rebuttal this by saying that we already do it, witnesses, humane, and resources. First, I'm gonna start on how they rebuttal it with resources. Um, a person who undergoes a voluntary euthanasia can save more life and prolong life by donating his or her organs, and also that it will save more resources because we are not going to spend more for those who are just gonna die, or who just uh for those people who are willing to die, we're gonna spend less, and it actually helps to invest more for other projects because we save more. And the next thing is about being human. Being humane, they claim that euthanasia is actually more human than letting them suffer because, again, the quality of life. Because if you're just gonna suffer, all everything that you will remember is about the suffering that you've had, and will and those suffering would overtaken your happy memories. And lastly, and the third is actually the witness. The witnesses actually claims that they feel relief and happiness when when they see the patient after, af- when the patient is already in peace after all the suffering that he went through, or she went through. And the last claim is about we already do it, so why not? There are a lot of states already who legalize euthanasia, and so why can't we? And we actually already do it on our dogs, and it is seen as act of kindness for them to not to suffer anymore. Why can't we see that as why can't we see that as well in humans as a act of kindness? And the last claim is about the doctor's role, or the Hippocratic Oath. This oath is actually sworn by each doctors when they graduated, and it says that it includes a promise to share knowledge, to help the ill and not cause harm, and not give a deadly drug or help another one to use one. So this oath actually is against euthanasia because it it harms a person to death, and it is against the medical ethics, of course. But some doctor claims that they are actually not harming them, but they see euthanasia as an act of compassion and caring, not killing, because they say that you free the ones who were suffering so much. So how was that harming if they are already hurting and you just freed them from the hurting that they are feeling? And for some, and actually there are a lot of regulation that is being done before a doctor or a physician to diagnose, to give prescription for voluntary euthanasia. In conclusion, proponents of the euthanasia see this as an act of compassion to life instead of intervention to the natural life process. They argue that euthanasia is acceptable if one's decision will not cause harm to the right of others. In addition, they claim that euthanasia will reduce the burden on healthcare resources. In contrast, opponents of euthanasia maintain that it is unethical in all aspects of human life. They hold a popular notion that that is a natural phenomenon, and therefore human beings lack the right to interfere with the life processes. However, there is no universal truth over whether euthanasia is right or wrong, which leads us to our current ethical dilemma. So, for my personal take on this issue, I believe that we live in an era that is far from a utopia. In this world, every resource has a limit, which makes every inch very valuable, and that is why we should use this wisely. I find the proponents of euthanasia makes more sense in laying out evidences and reasoning to the real world, in contrast to the claim of other party who usually relies on their religious beliefs, which makes a huge hole in their argument since nowadays the number of non-religion believers are already rising. Therefore, I believe that the act of euthanasia is an act of compassion and kindness to life, instead of intervening to its natural process. The only person who lives his life is the only one who can say whether he or she is satisfied to its life, which makes more sense for an individual to have the right when he or she had enough. And disclaimer that I only support voluntary euthanasia and non-voluntary euthanasia, and I will never support involuntary euthanasia. And that would be all. I hope that you had learned something on this presentation. Thank you.